Hello, my name is Brooke McMillan, and today I want to talk to you about a specific population of mentally ill offenders. So, about 1.3 million mentally ill individuals are incarcerated in our federal and state prisons as well as local jails. 93% of these individuals are men, while 73% are younger than 40. Now, these individuals experience a range of psychological disorders. 13% are cases of schizophrenia, while 10% are cases of antisocial personality disorder. And in 8% of these cases exhibit bipolar disorder. Now, 56 of these cases are substance related, and while this does not seem directly related to the issue at hand, substance abuse is very rampant within this population, and it's also considered a co-occurring disorder. So I felt that it was necessary to include that statistic. Now, about only 58% of these cases have had previous contact with psychiatric health care, which effectively exemplifies the gap here. So how did we get to this issue? Well, in 1970s, something happened called deinstitutionalization. Deinstitutionalization was the shutting down of public psychiatric hospitals. And so what this did was it left the whole population of mentally individuals without very many resources, without a way to ensure that they received their medication and other psychiatric services that they needed. This also left the future population of mentally ill individuals with less resources, a way to receive medication and to be in contact with those psychiatric services that they needed. And so what happened as a result here is that the sane asylum and the prison system within the United States essentially switched places. So as they say, the prison system became the new asylum. And so this is an issue. Why? Because jails and prisons are not designed to rehabilitate and treat psychological disorders. Not only are prisons ill-equipped to cater to psychological disorders and individuals with mental illnesses, but there's also a negative psychological impact associated with prison. And this is contributed to by overcrowding, violence. These mentally ill individuals are far more vulnerable and more likely to be victimized than non-mentally ill inmates. There's the issue of solitary confinement that's used as a form of punishment, and such they kind of term it like the hole or the shoe. And this has been shown to have negative impacts on individuals who are mentally healthy. Now imagine being schizophrenic or having some other sort of psychological disorder and being confined to one room by yourself, no human interaction or anything for 24 hours a day. There's also the lack of meaningful activity, which contributes to depression. There's also the isolation from social networks. So a lot of the times they're isolated from these social networks, which results in them being released without any type of family support, any type of friendships to rely on, any type of support system, things like that. Then there's also the issue of inadequate health services, which we're going to spend some time speaking about. So what's the issue? Well, there's 1.3 million mentally ill individuals flooding our prison systems. That's a large caseload. There's an understaffing of psychiatric professionals within the prison system, and this is most likely a result of the budget constraints our prison system experiences. Now, this is an issue that relates to mentally ill inmates because it actually costs more for taxpayers. Mentally ill offenders cost about $125 a day, whereas non-mentally ill offenders actually only cost $78 a day. And so there's a huge range in price, most likely because mentally ill offenders require psychiatric medications, which definitely increase the cost of their stay, as well as psychiatric services, which also increase the cost of their stay. And they're also a management issue as they are prone to violence and an increased number of suicide attempts. So your correctional officers need to be specially equipped as well as specially trained to handle this behavior, which also costs more money. And then there's the issue of re-entry into the prison system with this population. And so there's not only a lack of resources for this vulnerable population of mentally ill inmates within the prison system, but outside of the prison, there is also a lack of resources. And this lack of resources largely contribute to the problem of reentry. And so as we learned in class about mass incarceration rates within America, and how the negative issue with this is that they're oftentimes really trapped into that vicious cycle of reentry because there's not enough resources available to them upon being released. And this is most likely this is mostly due to the fact that they carry the negative stigma of being a felon. And so these ill offenders are oftentimes released from prison without sufficient medication, oftentimes only given 1 to 2 weeks worth of medication, which is great for 1 to 2 weeks, but what happens afterwards? Connections to mental health services, access to public assistance, and housing. So a lot of times they end up in homeless shelters and things like that, which is great because it feeds them, it houses them. But just like prisons, these homeless shelters are not equipped to cater to a psychological disorder. Also, access to public assistance. They have no way of ensuring their health benefits. It costs money to get your prescription filled. It costs money to see a psychiatric professional. They also carry the stigma of being a felon. Not only that, but the stigma of being mentally ill accompanies that. So it's almost like a double whammy. So some supporting evidence of how vulnerable this population is evident in Edwin Valdeseri's 1983 study, which in his study he found that mentally ill inmates were, and I quote, 4 times more likely to have been incarcerated for less serious charges compared with non-mentally ill inmates. So this contributes to the reentry issue. These people are being incarcerated in prison systems for non-violent crimes such as disorderly conduct, trespassing, harassment. Mentally ill persons are 3 times more likely to be charged with disorderly conduct, 5 times more likely to be charged with harassment, and 10 times more likely to be charged with harassment. I'm sorry, I meant to say 5 times more likely to be charged with trespassing. And so researchers typically find a direct relationship between the person's mental illness and the behavior that led to the charges. And so there's a discrepancy here. They're being criminalized for their behavior that is produced by mental illness. So they have a mental illness that causes them to behave in such a way that ends them up in prison, in which they're criminalized for this. It's almost like criminalizing a cancer patient who experiences negative symptoms such as nausea and things like that, and criminalizing them for their negative side effects of their illness. We're criminalizing mentally ill individuals for the negative side effects of their illness. I want to share with you a story from the documentary that I wrote, called Released from Frontline. It was produced by Frontline. And it showed the story of a lot of prisoners and their transition back into society, but one that I really thought was kind of the more successful stories was William Stokes. He'd been in and out of prison for years. He was schizophrenic, no family support, completely isolated from his family. He had a history of refusing medications, and when he refuses medications, he's very violent, which is the typical behavior that landed him in prison so many times. And so, upon being released this one time, he magically was connected with Bridgeview Manor. So he became a resident of Bridgeview Manor, which is basically a halfway house. I believe it's located in Ohio, that is specifically catering to not just inmates, but mentally ill inmates. And so a quote from William says, "They're going to make sure I take my medication." Yes, it seems so simple as just making sure this population takes their medication, but what places like Bridgeview Manor are doing is they're giving them an environment in which creates a support system, someone to make sure they stay with their medication, because their illness can sometimes play tricks on them and make them think that they don't need their medication, they don't need a psychiatric professional's help. But they do, and so this halfway house makes sure that they attend group therapy, individual therapy, and they receive their medication in sufficient dosages as well as consistent dosages, and they become this support system and help them successfully transition back into the community. And so I wanted to speak to you about human service professionals and what they're trained to do to help this population. They're trained to identify problems within these individuals, identify strengths and goals within these individuals to work towards, improve interpersonal and coping skills, which is a huge part with these mentally ill individuals, as well as another huge part is addressing mental health concerns. And so human service professionals that have earned their master's degree in some type of mental health area are actually allowed to counsel, diagnose, and treat emotional, psychological, and mental conditions. And so I imagine these are the individuals that are being employed by places like Bridgeview Manor and should be more often employed by the prison systems. They also are able to provide services to couples, families, and groups. So like I said, group therapy, maybe family therapy as well, reconnecting these individuals with their families and teaching their families to how to better help cope with their family members' illness, as well as help assist them and support them, because a lot of the times this illness does not only affect the individual, but it affects the people surrounding them as well, and it can be hard to handle. They also are able to apply theories, principles, and methods of counseling and psychotherapy. And they also develop plans of action aimed towards prevention, treatment, and resolution of psychological issues. This is important because they can prevent them from entering that cycle of reincarceration, treat their psychological disorder, and resolve any psychological issue. Now I want to talk to you about some policy changes and other solutions that would greatly benefit this particular vulnerable population. I want to start off by talking about two main diversion programs. One is pre-book programs, which divert mentally ill individuals to mental health services, rather than going straight to the judicial system and charging them with something and then incarcerating them, and then you wind up at point A, and you're caught up in the vicious cycle of reincarceration, and you're put in prison where it has negative psychological impact on these mentally ill individuals and also is ill-equipped to handle these psychological disorders. So overall, these pre-booking programs are just avoiding this by sending them directly to mental health services. And they're able to do this because it's like a working relationship between law enforcement officers and mental health professionals. So it's kind of like a crisis prevention team, and they're preventing and diverting them to go to mental health services. Then there's a post-booking program. And so what these do is they, again, divert these mentally ill individuals to psychiatric services. And except this is more like put into place perhaps afterwards, after being charged with something. These mentally ill individuals are taken to mental health courts, and here if it's a nonviolent crime, instead of just sending them directly to prison, they actually put them on probation, and then they enforce a strict adherence to psychiatric treatment. They're not able to enforce them to take their medication, but just sending them to a psychiatric professional on a consistent basis and having to adhere to some type of treatment is a solution in itself and very effective. And then there's reduced high incarceration rates. If we were to reserve prison for more violent crimes rather than nonviolent crimes, this would help with the overcrowding issue, free up more resources within a prison, as well as budget constraints. It would really alleviate the issue of budget constraints. Increase funding for mental health treatment in prison, as well as eliminate prolonged isolation of mentally ill prisoners, as this is shown to have negative impact on these individuals, as well as mentally healthy individuals, but it only exacerbates the conditions for these mentally ill individuals. And then to improve ex-prisoner access to public benefits covering mental health services. If these prisoners were released with access to things like Medicaid and such public assistance like that, they would be able to have more connections with mental health services. They would be able to afford their medication, have a way of getting it prescribed to them, refilled, things like that, and be connected with more programs that can further assist their mental health conditions. So now we're at the references page, and I just want to summarize this presentation and my experience with studying this population by saying that there needs to be a clear, defined bold line between criminalizing these individuals and rehabilitating these individuals, because oftentimes people think that prison is in place to rehabilitate all types of individuals, violent ones, non-violent ones, mentally ill, non-mentally ill, and yet there is a lack of resources within prisons, specifically a lack of resources for mentally ill individuals. And so due to this lack of resources, it makes it impossible to accomplish this rehabilitation. And therefore, we're instead subjecting them to a lifelong label of being a felon, as well as a lifelong label of being mentally ill. And it's just, as we learned in class, a vicious cycle. Thank you.